Okay, so again, this isn't blasphemy. God has given us His Spirit. Just like we have a human spirit to think as a human, now we have God's Spirit to think as God. Just as we read, to be partakers of the divine nature. Let's look at it again, just because it's so extraordinary. 2 Peter 1, this time I'll pick it up a verse earlier in verse 3. 2 Peter 1, 3. His divine power has given us everything we need for a life. Remember the tree of the knowledge of good and evil versus the tree of life we talked about? The need for this change to be able to be eternally sustainable, to live forever? His divine power, not ours, has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. Through these, He has given us His very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature. Why? Because we have the Spirit of God that helps us to think and feel and act like God, just like the human spirit helps us to think and feel and act like a human. Just like we saw, again, coming back to Romans 5 and verse 5, we see the Holy Spirit is the absolute key. We have the Holy Spirit, so therefore we can think like God. Romans 5:5, hope does not disappoint because God has poured out His love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit. Here we see the implementation plan. Here we see how it happens. And as we contrast these two ways of thinking, the one that is based upon the human spirit versus the one that is based upon God's Spirit, frankly, as I mentioned before, God is changing us from a based insanity to sanity. I mean, if you think about it, by human standards, we would think Jesus Christ was insane. I mean, if we came across a person who had absolutely everything, who was willing to give it all up, and on top of that, he knew he was going to die, and he had the power to keep others from killing him, but he chose not to stop others from killing him, but rather willingly chose to die for others for whom he had nothing to gain. Well, let's put it into greater terms. Contrasting God to humanity, God dying for humanity. Here we have a man who has everything. He has all power. He knows he's going to die. He has the power to stop it. And instead he willingly chooses to be killed for a bunch of pesky flies who do nothing but spread disease and hurt. What would we do with a person like that who's willing to kill himself, in effect, because he has the power over life and death for a bunch of flies to save them? We'd probably lock him up and say he was a danger to himself. We would say that's utter insanity. That makes no sense as a human being. And we're right, because we're thinking from the human selfish spirit. On the other hand, from God's perspective, with God's Spirit, it is utter insanity not to give one's life for these pesky flies. Because that was love. To not love, to not put love before self, to God is insane. So we see how great a salvation this is that God offers to us. He's not just rescuing us from death, from our selfishness. He's rescuing us from just an absolutely insane way of thinking. As I say, the world is upside down and backwards, and we don't even realize it. Because it's good enough right now, until we blow ourselves out of oblivion, or until something really awful happens in our lives and we wonder why we're even alive. Isn't death better? Until we come to that point, we think, this isn't so bad. Yes, it is. It's insane. Life that's lived for self is insane from God's perspective. Just like the life of Jesus, to give himself up when he didn't have to gain nothing, is insane from the human perspective. Which one do we want? God offers to put his Spirit in us, to save us from our insanity, so that we no longer think and feel and act just as a human with the human spirit, but we think and feel and act as God does, with God's Spirit, partakers of the divine nature. we are only saved from this insanity. We are only saved from this slavery to self by Christ living in us through the Holy Spirit. It is only by His living in us daily, the living Christ living in us daily by the Holy Spirit, that we can be transformed, that we can become the partaker of this divine nature. Once again, we see that there is no Christianity without Christ. There can be a religion that has historical beliefs. There can be a religion that has dogma and practices. But it's dead unless the living Jesus lives in it every day through the Holy Spirit, pouring out the love of God into our hearts. The old business model, the old way of doing business is insane. But we're so used to it, we don't realize it. If we're going to come to sanity and to sustainability, the old way of doing business must be replaced with a new way of doing business. In Christian terms, we would talk about the old self and the new creation. And that's the subject of our next session. The Christian Journey book and the full-sized, full-quality, complete video series are available for free download at www.spiritualoutreach.com.